So for the past 40 weeks, I think it is, we've been working our way pretty much word by word through the Gospel according to St. Mark. And this morning we're going to wrap it all up by looking at the final episode where Jesus rises from the dead. Now, we know for certain that if it wasn't for what the ancient church called the resurrection, Jesus would have been nothing more than a one-line reference in Josephus's history of the Jewish people. We know that during the first century, Palestine was saturated with both charismatic leaders and those who eagerly followed them. Everyone knew someone who was a follower of the next big idea and the next big teacher. For example, in the early part of the first century, round about the same time as Jesus, there was a man called Judas the Galilean, and he was the big thing. And there was an entire movement based around his personality and his vision. Then a little bit later, slightly after Jesus, there was another man called Simon Bar Gloria, and there was a movement based around his personality and his teaching. And there were lots and lots of these figures, and they were all pretty much like Jesus. They all said stuff, they all did stuff, they all promised stuff, and they were all followed by lots and lots of people, and then they all died. And interestingly, when they died, the movements that they created did not immediately die with them, as you might expect. Rather, what happened was the followers of these early visionary religious or political movements then immediately elected new leaders who would carry on where the founding leader left off. So, given that that's the case, immediately following the death of Jesus, the Kingdom of God movement that he created ought to have had as its very first order of business the election of a new leader who would carry on where Jesus left off, but it didn't. Unusually, and in fact uniquely for the ancient world, the church carried on regarding Jesus as being its leader and carried on following his teachings. Furthermore, they decided to travel all around the world, inviting others to join them in this movement, all because of what they called resurrection. At no point did the early church ever speak of Jesus' personality, or his vision, or his teaching in the past tense. For our forebearers, he was alive. He was resurrected. Now, when we hear the word resurrection, I think we are immediately disadvantaged because we attach to the hearing of that word our 20th century Christian heritage. So we know the story about Jesus rising from the dead. We talk about it at Easter. We know what we think it means. And I think that our developed understanding of that story disadvantages us from understanding what the early church meant and what they felt and what they experienced as they told the story. So what I want to do for you this morning, as we wrap up this journey in Mark's Gospel, is try and help you understand how that story would have been understood in the first century. And that will help us have a better clue what it might mean for us today to believe in resurrection. So, without further ado, if you lived in Galilee round about the year 30 AD, and you heard a person use this word resurrection, you would immediately attach to your hearing of that word this kind of imagery. You see, where most cultures in the ancient world had a highly sophisticated theology of life after death, Jewish culture didn't. The Egyptians had one, the Greeks had one, the Romans had one. They all had elaborate systems that sought to explain what might happen to a person after they died. But that kind of thinking is largely absent from Jewish thought. In the whole of the Hebrew Bible, there is no clearly articulated theology of life after death. There are clues, there are snippets, there are ideas, but there's no elaborate system that explains in detail what might happen to us after we die. However, a key theme in the Hebrew Bible, perhaps the key theme in the Hebrew Bible, is the idea that one day God will restore and renew and fix the areas of life that are damaged and broken and that no longer work. Stop. When we come to a place like this Sunday by Sunday, we do a pretty good job of giving the impression that everything in life is fine. That our life works because we figured it out. But were we being honest, we would have to admit that there are many areas of our life that are less than ideal, that are broken, that are disrepaired, that have fallen apart, that aren't working. And for persons of faith, this creates a tension. Because we have, after all, read page 1 of the Bible story, where God created a really good world. And then on the following pages, we get the impression that when God created men and women, He intended for them to live really good lives in a really good world, where everything worked, where everything was all right, where everything was fine. However, the reality of life often looks a little more like this. I'm speaking in metaphor here, but oftentimes all that is left of the dreams that God had for us on page 1 of the Bible, and of the dreams that we once had for ourselves and how life would be, are the bare bones of what might have been. And so in the Hebrew Bible, the poets and the preachers and the prophets often spoke in the future tense of a time when God would fix it, when God would repair the damage and heal the wounds and make life work again the way we once hoped it would. The most famous example of this, I think, comes from a part of the Hebrew Bible called the prophecy of Ezekiel, where in a vision he speaks to a thing called a valley of bones, and in surreal language the prophet says to these dead bones, "I will make breath to enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin, and you will come to life." And so was born in early Hebrew thinking the concept of resurrection. It was originally used as a metaphor for God renewing and restoring the fortunes of the people He loved. To speak of resurrection, then, is to speak of the areas of life that are not. It is to speak of where the joy is not, where the relationship is not, where the health is not, where the peace is not, where the morality is not, where the hope is not. It is to speak into everything that is lacking and broken and damaged. And then, over a period of several hundred years, the concept of resurrection began to be used, around about the time of the New Testament actually, to refer to a time when God would kick off a new reality on earth, a way of living in which men and women would live in relationship with God, when God would be close to them, and in this newness things would work again. There would be joy again, there would be peace again, there would be morality again, there would be hope again. Resurrection meant something like a new and a better life in this world. A life that worked. a life that wasn't broken, a life that wasn't so much of a struggle. And the rising from the dead bit came from first century Jews who believed that those who lived in the hope of this new and better life, and who even fought for it, but who died before they saw it, would one day be resurrected physically and take their place in the better life to come. For example, there's a story in a Jewish text called Maccabees, in which a person was fighting for this new and better life. He lost the fight, and as he was being tortured by this nasty person, he says, "I choose to die at the hands of men, with the God-given hope of being resurrected to the life to come. But you, sir, there will be no resurrection for you." So, to sum up, if you lived at the time of the New Testament, and you heard this word, resurrection, you would immediately think of two things. First of all, you would think of God restoring everything that was broken and damaged. You would think of one day God fixing life and making it work again in a way that it presently does not. And secondly, you would think about God rising from the dead all those who hoped for and who fought for this new and a better life and world. So then the concept of resurrection in the first century isn't primarily about going to heaven when you die. It isn't principally even about being brought back to life. Resurrection to these first century Jews was about a new way of living. A new way of living that worked, that was better, that wasn't broken, that wasn't damaged, that wasn't so in need of repair so often. So with that at the forefront of our minds, let's close off our study in Mark's Gospel. In verse 40 of chapter 15, Mark concludes the story of the crucifixion by bothering to mention that several women were there watching from a distance. Now, the word watching that Mark uses here is a word that he's used on 3 previous occasions to refer to observation that doesn't lead to understanding. I think it's a given that just because we see things, that doesn't necessarily mean that we understand the things that we are seeing, right? Is that a fair comment? For example, I used to live in the city of Edinburgh, and I went to school in a very old building that was right next to Edinburgh Castle. And no word of a lie, one day I was on my way to school, and some, not being racist, but some Americans got out of the train station, which is pretty close to the castle, and they actually said, no word of a lie, "Gee, isn't it great they built the castle so close to the train station?" Fantastic. And we laugh, but in less crass ways, we make mistakes like that all the time. It is a given that just because we see things around us and we see things in our life, we don't always understand what we're seeing. And we don't always understand the things that we're going through. We read newspapers, we watch television, we walk around malls, we see things happening in our workplaces, in our families, but we don't understand necessarily all the things that we're looking at. And we certainly don't understand things properly and in the right way all the time. And that's exactly what Mark is telling us about these particular women. They are seeing Jesus die, correct? But they don't understand what it means, what it's about. Nevertheless, it needs to be said that at least they're there. Mark bothers to give us more details about these women. He says, among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Jose the Mexican, and Salome. That was a joke. Then more detail. In Galilee, where it all began, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Then more detail. Many other women who had also come up to Jerusalem were also there. So clearly and unusually for the ancient world, This kingdom of God movement that began 3 years earlier in Galilee, that was organized so carefully around the personality and the teachings and the actions of Jesus, was heavily, heavily populated by women. They were not a periphery part of the movement, because notice Mark uses the key and loaded word, follow. They were followers of Jesus, just like the men. And I find all this fascinating, because not a single one of the core group of followers that have featured so heavily in Mark's story up until this point are anywhere to be seen now. Where are the men? Where are the people who are supposed to be strong and tough? Where are the people who like to watch action movies and are okay with a little bit of blood and guts? They have ran away and have given up and are depressed and hiding. But staying with Jesus to the bitter end are a group of hitherto largely unmentioned women. True, there are negatives here. They watched at a distance. They didn't understand what it was they were seeing. They're on the edge and they're a little bit dumb. But following Jesus at a distance, Mark's point, I think here, is better than not following him at all. And so I like these women. I think highly of them. I admire them. And then into this interesting story about a group of very loyal, brave women, Mark inserts another story about an equally loyal and equally brave man who helps take care of Jesus' funeral. So in verse 42 we're told that it was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. So according to Jewish law you can't have a funeral on the Sabbath, so he wants to take care of it a day early. Mark tells us that as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, so this is fascinating, he's one of the establishment. He's one of the men who would have been there at Jesus' trial earlier that day. He's one of the men who would have been there as Jesus was being slapped in the face and spat upon. Clearly he wasn't part of that abuse, however, because Mark's careful to tell us that he too, notice what it says, is waiting for the kingdom of God. So here's a person who was probably a covert follower of Jesus. He was a Christian, he just didn't want anyone to know about it. However, now that Jesus has gone, that's gone. There's no hope for him now of a better life. No hope for him now of God fixing what he sees as being broken. All that remains for him, humanely, is to give Jesus a decent burial. And he wants to do this because he's Jewish. Good Jews were and still are fastidious about making sure that even the nastiest of people are given the best possible of funerals. It's an important part of their morality. For example, the Jewish historian Josephus says with horror, look at the next slide, I think I wrote it down, yeah. So he's talking here about some hardcore criminals, and he's saying these people go so far in their impiety as to actually throw out bodies without giving them a proper burial. This is an anathema in Jewish thought. So Joseph, as a good Jew, is saying, got to deal with a body, got to deal with a body, got to at least do something right for this man who got everything so wrong. For this man who raised our hopes so high and left us so very low. So in verse 43, Mark says that Joseph goes boldly to Pilate and asks for Jesus' body. Now under normal circumstances, people who were sentenced to death on crosses were made to stay on those crosses, not just until they had died, but until they had completely decomposed. This again was part of the psychological warfare that we spoke about last Sunday. That said, however, the Roman justice system was reasonable. And so in like 9 cases out of 10, I think, if a loved one went to a Roman magistrate and said, look, can you let me bury my husband? Can you let me bury my dad? In 9 cases out of 10, a magistrate would say, yeah, all right, fair enough. The only exception to that rule was if the person was being executed for the crime of high treason, as Jesus was. So this man, in asking for the body of Jesus, who was technically executed for sedition against Rome, is taking a huge risk. Which is why Mark is cautious to tell us that Joseph went to Pilate boldly. He's brave. He's aligning himself to a person convicted of sedition. To put this in a reasonably modern context, this would be like 8 years ago or whenever it was, some guy with a hairy back and a big beard going into an FBI branch office in Boston and saying, "Excuse me, I hear you've killed my friend Osama bin Laden. Can I have his body to give him a proper burial?" That person would be immediately whisked into a back office and arrested and probably never seen again. This is the risk. This is exactly what Joseph is now doing. However, when Pilate hears that Jesus is already dead, we're told that he was surprised. Normally it took a person 3 days to die on a cross, not 3 hours, as was the case with Jesus. So just to be sure, Pilate asks his soldiers, has Jesus really died? He's not going to fall for that one again. He wants to make sure it's all above board, and when he hears that he is in fact dead, he gives the body to Joseph. Amazing. That, for me, proves the suspicion that we had last Sunday. Pilate knows what's going on. Pilate knows Jesus is no criminal. He knows this was a scam and he just got sucked up in it and he had no choice. No way would someone convicted of treason in Roman law be allowed to do this. Pilate knows. Take the body, do what you got to do. He's okay. Next sentence. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, placed it in a tomb cut out of rock, and then rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. So, a little bit of technical detail here. When a person died in the 1st century, their body was initially washed, then scented with some spices, and then wrapped very tightly in cloth. After that, the body was then laid on a stone shelf somewhere to decompose, which didn't take all that long in Palestine. And then once the body had completely decomposed, the bones were then gathered up and placed inside one of these. This is a bone box, an ossuary. Some of you come from cultures that still use these. And then this little box, about this size, was placed with the family. So either in a crypt or in some villages in the Near East under the floorboards. Seriously, that's where you kept your loved ones, under the floorboards. Not in a creepy way, just that's where you kept your family and your grandparents and so on. And this is what the phrase means in the Old Testament. He was gathered to his fathers. He died, the bones were gathered, and he was placed with his fathers and his forefathers and his forefathers. So we see all of those details in this sentence. Then in verse 47 we're told that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jose, saw where he was laid. And again, this word saw is the same word that Mark used in verse 40. It means they saw, but they had no comprehension of what it was they were seeing. They were going through events in their life and they were seeing those events clear as day, but everything that they were seeing and interpreting, their interpretation was wrong. Tangent. Could this be true for you? You're going through stuff and you're seeing the stuff that you're going through, but all of your self-talk and all of your conclusions and all of the things that you're thinking about that stuff are wildly wrong. And the wild wrongness is causing you to make wrong moves, which are making things worse. Could that at least be true? Back to the text. These people, what are they seeing? They are seeing Jesus die. They are seeing Jesus get buried. And they are attaching to what they are seeing their cultural understanding of what it means to die and be placed on a shelf and to decompose and have your bones gathered to your fathers and placed in a box. And operating within all of those assumptions, Mary and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, they bring spices, we are told, so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. The purpose of this spice anointing is, not to be too graphic, but for smell reduction. Bodies in first century Israel were not embalmed as they were in ancient Egypt. They were just made to smell nice. And again, think of how this is a loving thing to do, is it not? How bought in were they to Jesus to do this? They were all in. Good, decent, loyal, caring women whose decency and loyalty extends beyond the death of the one to whom they were loyal. Even though they're wrong in what they're seeing, I still like them nonetheless. These are good, good women. Then after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. And while they were going there, they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance? Good question. So here's a first century tomb of the type that Jesus would have been buried in. As you can see, there's a large circular stone. And the stone is inserted into a slightly angled groove. You roll the stone downhill to seal the tomb, and then you roll it uphill to open the tomb. And obviously this is beyond the physical means of these women. Frankly, seeing the stone, it would be beyond my means as well. So hence the question, who's going to roll this stone away for us? And again, this is an aside, but let me remind you that what we are reading this morning was our Christian forebearers' first ever attempt at writing down their biggest idea: resurrection. The Gospel of Mark, we know, was the first Gospel to be written. This was their first crack at it. This was when they committed the story to writing, to share it with the world. This is our story of our big idea. This is their evidence, and that is the case. It is truly remarkable for me that women feature so highly in the story. And I say that that's remarkable because, of course, this is the ancient world, and in the ancient world, women simply don't count. In the Mishnah, for example, it's careful to say that in a legal situation, the evidence of a woman is not to be listened to. In the Talmud, it's careful to say that it's better to be born a dog than to be born a woman. It's also careful to say that happy is he whose children are male, but woe is him whose children are female. Fascinating, don't you think then, that in an ancient culture that is so inherently and comprehensively dismissive of women, particularly their capacity to understand anything and see anything, so much so that they're not even allowed to give evidence in court, that the church should be so open about saying, we got this story from a bunch of women. For me, this is one of the things that proves the historicity of the ancient story. Because if you were making up this story, you'd invent a better lie. The first witnesses would all be men, and they'd all be clever. None of them would be women, if this were a lie. Anyway, that's an aside. In the next sentence, their worries about moving the heavy stone disappear when they see that the stone had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting there, and they were alarmed. In the Bible, the word white is a clue word for angel. So as these women enter the tomb and they see this figure, they immediately have a "what is this" moment. Like, what is this? They have no way, they have no framework to process the thing they are seeing, which is why Mark uses the word alarmed. The word alarmed in this context means a combination of shocked, afraid, and amazed. Like I don't know where to put this. This thing I'm seeing, I don't know I don't know. In the next sentence, the angel addresses their fear and says, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus who was crucified. Now, cast your eye to the word looking, please. In this 40-week journey through Mark's Gospel, this is now the 10th time that I will have explained to you the meaning of this word looking. Mark always uses this word negatively to describe what people are doing when they try and put their agenda and their constraints onto Jesus. So, for example, earlier in his story, when Mark said that the crowds of people were looking for Jesus, what Mark meant by that was they wanted to take Jesus and put him into their mold and make him their political leader. They were looking for him with an agenda. In chapter 3, when Mark said that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was looking for Jesus, Mark meant she was looking for him to put a straight jacket on him and put him in a lunatic asylum, because she was so concerned about the things he was saying and the things he was doing. So in using this negative word, looking, the angel is giving the girls a little bit of a slap on the face. They came to this grave with a clear agenda. And the agenda is a decent one. The agenda is about moving on. The agenda is about closure. The agenda is about just doing the things you need to do after the person you loved passes on. It's just something you do because it helps you deal with the things you're going through. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. In fact, everything is right about all of that. But it is, nonetheless, a very clear agenda. The Jesus they are looking for is dead. This is what they see. This is what they understand. So the angel says, contra to them, you are looking, by which he means you're looking for your agenda, you are looking for your preconceived ideas about all the things you are going through, but you will not find what you're looking for. Everything you understand about your present circumstance is wrong. All you see is what is not. All you see is what is broken, what is not working, what is needs to be fixed, and what can never be fixed. That is all you see. Fair enough. But you will not find what you're looking for. Because he is risen. He is not here. See where they laid him. Go now, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, where it all began. There you will see him, just as he told you. Now let's move on to verse 8. Verse 8, I know in your English Bible, Mark doesn't end at verse 8, but the bit from verse 8 to the end is probably an addition, probably not Mark's original story. We know that because the earliest copies of Mark that we have all end at verse 8. Look at how Mark originally ended his story. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled to the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, because they were afraid. And that's how he ends his story, with the word afraid. The resurrection, it seems, did not magically dispel their fears or transform them immediately into something they weren't. Rather, it gave them a terrifying event that forced them to make a choice. They had to choose in those early days between, on the one hand, saying, I had something, but now it's broken. I believed something, but it was in vain. I hoped for something, but my hopes were dashed. Jesus was great, Jesus was amazing, Jesus promised much, but it didn't work out. There was that choice. Or on the other hand, there was a choice of saying, Jesus is alive, and everything I once hoped for came true, and it's still worth following, it's still worth believing, and things are good. And so I keep on keeping on. It forced them into that choice. So back to resurrection then. For a Jew living in the first century, the whole idea of resurrection was about a new way of living in this world. a way made possible by God transforming brokenness into life. And the early church confidently behaved as though this had happened. Our early Christian forebearers organized themselves as a resurrection movement. Their big idea, spread by men like Mark, was that this new reality that we hope for has come. It's here, it's now. God has restored, God has fixed, God has renewed. Now, there can be peace, there can be morality, there can be hope. We can know God living within us. We can live, as Jesus said, with a sense of the abundant life that God wished for us to have on page 1 of the Bible. The early church behaved as though all of that was true. They behaved as though everything they hoped for, they got, here and now. And they behaved that way in the middle of the Colosseum. Do you know what I mean? They found this way of living with the tension of I am a Christian and there is hope and there is life and I do have joy and I do have peace and I do have an abundant sense of all these things being real in the here and in the now. Those standing 6 feet away from me are Nero's lions. Our faith is not primarily concerned with life after death. It isn't. That is a modern invention. Our faith is primarily concerned just with life. Life. It seeks to understand how to be a person of faith and fully know the life and the joy and the peace and the love of God, whilst being, married and having a boyfriend or a girlfriend and working and driving to work and watching television. And how do I do all those things whilst being a person of faith? I tried to put this in a simple diagram for you. Here's life, right? On the one side of the screen. This is life for all of us. Got to get the children to their stuff. Never ends. Got to take care of them. Got to feed them. Got to drive them to judo and hockey and soccer. I've got to get ahead at work because I just do. I've got to keep the boss happy, got to keep the clients happy, got to survive the co-worker gossip and all that. I just got to do a lot of people to keep happy. And, there's bills to pay and there's stuff, and hopefully I can squeeze in, a little bit of personal pleasure. Maybe find some gym time. That'd be great. We'll go to a yoga class. And that, with a little more detail, is the life we all live. Busy, 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 trying to take care of our responsibilities and hoping for a little bit of pleasure where we can grab it, right? Isn't that life? Then alongside that, we have our faith, with all of its big ideas and its big themes like peace, joy, and forgiveness, and hope, and a better life and a better world. And all too often, these things are separate things. We think of the former things Monday to Saturday and the latter thing for an hour on a Sunday. Our continual challenge is to mesh the two, so that as we live this life of ours, we live it as people who believe in resurrection. As we drive the kids to work and take care of the things we have to take care of and deal with all the stuff of life, we do it as people who believe right here, right now, in hope, in peace, in joy, in forgiveness, and wholeness. I think so much of life is a matter of perspective. Don't you think that? Like, you go through stuff, but it's just, a lot of it is perspective. For example, everyone always says the Titanic was a disaster. But for those lobsters in the kitchen waiting to get cooked, that iceberg was a miracle. Right? So resurrection then. Speaks powerfully into what is not for you. It speaks to where the joy is not. To where the peace is not. To where the security is not. To where the companionship is not. To where the love is not. To where the health is not. To where the hope is not. To where the life is not. And defiantly and discordantly says, not, does not have the final word. There is, my Christian friend, new life that is abundant and full, and it is here, and it is now, and it is not yet. These are the tensions we live with as Christians, day by day, week by week. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through Mark's Gospel. Next week we're starting a short series called Listening to Win. We're going to be talking about how we can... I'll give you a little summary of what we're talking about. Do you ever... What time is it before I do that?
11:30.
11:30. I'll give you a 1-minute summary. I bet in your life there's people that you're trying to get through to, and it's like banging your head off a brick wall. So this new series that we're going to be starting next week is all about stop banging your head off a brick wall and search for the loose brick, pick away at that and watch it all crumble down, and finally connect and finally get through to that person you need to get through to. It's going to be relevant for your family life, for your relationships, for your businesses, for your careers. Listening to win. It's a Christian virtue. We need to get better at listening, folks. Thank you for coming. God bless you richly. See you next Sunday.